Let's start off with Lauren. Lauren, what was the most interesting thing you saw in the primary?
Yeah, so I was following the U.S. Senate and state House races, and the U.S. Senate was not a surprise. We had heard from polls, from analysts, from folks following the race for basically the entire primary that Alyssa Slotkin and Mike Rogers were the front runners. That race was called very early in the evening, so that wasn't a huge surprise. What was interesting was in some of the state House primaries, there were two incumbents who were Republicans who were defeated by primary challengers, Representatives Neil Frisky and Bob Bezot. So that was interesting to me. A couple of Metro Detroit lawmakers had pretty close races, particularly Regina Weiss and Alvis Farhat in Metro Detroit, but they were able to survive, as were most all of the other 35 incumbent lawmakers who face primary challenges. So those are probably some of the interesting races.
Simon, what surprised you about last night's results?
Yeah, I would say that I was particularly surprised by just the level of repudiation that we saw in some of these races against some hard right candidates from Ottawa County, where some of these county commission candidates were denied a majority on the county commission. It seems at most they can get 4 out of 11 seats, I believe. And then also some of these primary elections, such as State Rep Neil Frisky losing his primary to Parker Fairbairn up by Charlevoix. It shows that, because Michigan in part is a crossover state, meaning that you don't have to be a registered member of a political party to vote in their primary, that, and speaking to pollster Richard Schuba earlier this morning, he said that, this was sort of a uniting of Democrats, Republicans, and independents to sort of vote against these candidates and bring in more moderate Republicans, whether or not they may be able to win in the general election. And that this is sort of something that's relatively unusual. So the extent to which this effort was a success among these candidates was pretty fascinating.
For sure. JD Vance, Trump's running mate, is in Michigan today. Kamala Harris is going to be here tonight and tomorrow. Jordan, what does this tell you about the state of play in Michigan?
So, I mean, Michigan is one of 6 swing states that anybody is going to need to basically win the election. So it's no surprise that we're seeing an intense focus on Michigan right now, especially considering that both of the candidates, Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic nominee, and former President Donald Trump, just recently selected their vice presidential running mates. So, it's getting FaceTime with these voters. It's introducing their VP pick, who is, thought to kind of be political weather vane in terms of how they're trying to reach out to the people. So Michigan, it's a swing state. We're going to be seeing this level of attention from now until November, with, in fact, it likely ramping up, frankly. So I will be going to Vice President Kamala Harris's rally tonight in Detroit. She's also expected to have another appearance in Metro Detroit Thursday. I believe it's going to be a UAW-related event. So, like I said, we should just expect to see more of this for the next couple months.
And we have reporters all across the state making sure that we are at those events. We had Janelle James, one of our reporters, at the JD Vance event this morning. He was there in Macomb County, and he described Trump's plan for mass deportations of immigrants who enter the country illegally. It sounds like a huge undertaking. How did Vance say that would happen?
Yeah, it is an enormous logistical undertaking. I think that that's undeniable, but I think it's also important to put these numbers in context, right? I think I really want to emphasize here that deportations actually were on their highest level historically during the presidency of Barack Obama from 2008 through about 2013. They were at a high level of above 350,000 a year and have not reached that level since. They declined precipitously during the first few years of President Joe Biden's administration, but that's because, in part, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it's important to note that as well, this would be a huge administrative undertaking. He wants to talk about how they would create it harder for business owners to hire people who are not in the country, who are not entered the country legally, and that they want to sort of target people who are violent criminals. But essentially what he's saying is a ramping up of a lot of the procedures that are already in place. I mean, it's not easy necessarily to have on paper people, undocumented migrants working for you in a lot of circumstances in most sectors. And at the same time, violent criminals are targeted for deportation if they're caught and prosecuted in many instances. And so this is a huge talking point. It's a pillar of Republican support. When you look at the Republican National Convention, they're handing out signs that said on them, mass deportations now. So it's something that would be a key promise, I'd say akin to the phrase build the wall that we heard in 2016, that if elected, Trump and Vance would want to get done. But of course, it's a whole suite of policies, and building out, making more robust Customs and Border Protection and immigrations and ICE would be in a huge administrative undertaking.
Well, and if I could cut in for a second too, part of those remarks, Simon just touched on, were to talk about business owners not using undocumented immigrants as their employees. But in many of those sectors, agriculture among them, undocumented immigrants do make up a large portion of the labor force. And those are jobs by and large that individuals do not want to do. And I don't know if that's something that necessarily is being fully thought through here when calling for mass deportations, because it'll have an immediate and serious effect if it does end up taking place. Obviously, I know they mentioned going after criminals first, but if this mass deportation plan does end up taking place, it has some serious implications for many industries across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the big complaints you hear from farmers is the lack of visas for seasonal agricultural workers who can come from Mexico and other Latin American countries to work in these fields seasonally and then go back again on a legal basis, that there's not enough visas for this. And all of these other jobs that are being taken up by undocumented immigrants, to have that hole in the economy happen relatively abruptly would be a huge shock.
Harris on Tuesday announced that Midwest dad and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate. It was only yesterday, feels like a long time ago. It ended a couple weeks of speculation. Walz has a Michigan connection. What is it?
Yeah, there was sort of a viral moment relatively soon after his announcement where a photo of him appeared where he was wearing a Michigan State t-shirt and holding a bottle of Vernors, which are sort of, obviously iconic, archetypal Michigan iconography there. And this is something that goes on between governors quite a bit, which is they make a bet on sports, and then the loser just has to appear in a photo of shame wearing the regalia of the team that had beat out their own. And so my understanding is that in 2019, Spartans had defeated the Golden Gophers, University of Minnesota team in March Madness. And so as a result, he was compelled then to represent that team. And so I think that we're going to be seeing probably a lot more of this image, especially from Democrats who want to show that he's a friendly face in Michigan.
Speaking of vibes, Walz appears to be a big fan of Minnesota music. He loves The Replacements, Husker Du, and Hold Steady. Lauren, you're our resident pop punk expert, or not pop punk, punk rock expert. What should his campaign song be?
Well, as you mentioned, Minnesota has a pretty deep bench of indie rock bands. And so on Twitter, shortly after the Walz announcement, you had fans of this music saying, would Walz be the first vice presidential candidate who's been to a Hold Steady show or a Husker Du show, for example? I think that perhaps with some artful editing, Can't Hardly Wait by The Replacements might be a fun campaign walk-on song. But if we're going with the Hold Steady, the song Constructive Summer would probably be a good choice.
Love the infrastructure moment right there. And Laura knows a lot about infrastructure as well. If you all have questions about the primary results yesterday or the upcoming November election, make sure to put them in the chat and we will get to them. Earlier in this election cycle, there was a sense of voter apathy and resignation about November, especially from Democratic voters and those unhappy with the idea of a second Trump term. Now we're seeing memes about coconut trees. We see references to Brat Summer. What changed?
After the debate between President Biden and former President Trump, Democrats were despondent. The polls were tanking. Candidates in Michigan and elsewhere were deciding whether they supported the incumbent president for a second term or whether they should have him step aside. It was a dark time for Democrats. And after he decided to step away from the election and endorse Vice President Harris, Democrats, young and old, got kind of a surge of hope. So that's a lot of what you're seeing with Brat Summer. That's a big Gen Z effort to connect Harris to a British pop singer, Charlie XCX. which I thought was interesting. But whether or not, this lasts for 90 days, it remains to be seen. We'll see how Harris and Walz continue to perform in Michigan and elsewhere in battleground states. But at this initial reaction, at least, was really just a sigh of relief by Democrats that there is a younger, more energized candidate heading into November.
So vibes are one thing, memes are one thing, but these candidates are also trying to earn the American people's vote. Jordan, has Harris and Trump answered a lot of questions to the media and to the general public?
So not really, no. Since being the Democratic nominee for president, I personally cannot recall a time that Harris has taken questions from members of the media. Excuse me, last month, I went to another Harris campaign ahead of her actually being understood as the candidate of choice for 2024 Democrats. And there was a lot of waiting around, but there was no question asking to be done there. I know that was something that JD Vance earlier today did razz reporters about at his own stop in Shelby Township earlier this morning. So they're not quite talking to reporters, and that is a pretty big deal, frankly. I mean, obviously we have our own stake in wanting to get the best possible journalism we can, but I mean, by and large, journalists do serve as a sort of proxy for the voter. If we can't get in contact with candidates, if we can't get them to ask questions that people like you have, what are they even doing then? Frankly, if they're meant to represent the people, then they need to be able to answer to the people.
Yeah, if I could add on to that a little bit, I think one of the things that's really concerning to me as a reporter is that in our area of social media, politicians increasingly have an ability to communicate directly with voters, essentially doing an end around legacy media and people that are going to ask them difficult questions. This is something that's being adopted on a broadly bipartisan basis. And so when this happens and, we see politicians avoid contact with reporters who aren't going to ask them easy questions, it's certainly disconcerting for us because we aren't able to provide that level of accountability that readers entrust us to use.
Yeah, that seems like a definite concern and something to keep an eye out for. We had a reader who wanted to know what we can learn from yesterday's election and how it's going to impact Michigan Democrats' goals of retaining the state house. Right now, Michigan Democrats have a 2-person lead. What can we learn from yesterday's election results?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Because the first thing after an August primary and election year, you want to be able to read into the tea leaves and know what this portends for November. And I spoke earlier today with Corwin Schmidt. He's a professor of political science at Michigan State University, and he's been tracking turnout year over year at all of these different elections to see, what this might mean. And so what he's finding is that turnout is down slightly from what we saw in 2022 and in 2020. But he still believes that it's on track. He said a little bit above 2 million voters here, about 2.1 million, and that we're on track in his modeling to see about 5.5 million voters, which is pretty close to what we saw in these prior elections. Now, he also wanted to dispel sort of some assumptions that or conventional wisdom that high turnout might be necessarily in favor of Democrats. He said that that's not necessarily the case because, again, we have a crossover primary. It's hard to know who voted for what in terms of partisan affiliation. And at the same time, you can't necessarily translate that in November to individual enthusiasm for that. But, there was also rain yesterday, which can affect turnout because people don't want to show up to their polling places. There's a lot of factors that can influence that. And 90 days as well is a long time. But again, to what Lauren said earlier, the pivot from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket has been a sea change for Democrats. They now don't necessarily have solely someone to vote against, but someone to vote for in a lot of respects. And so it's going to be interesting to see if they can maintain that momentum all the way through until November. But this turnout essentially was a sigh of relief for some Democrats who were concerned that there was going to be some broad protest or a sign of widespread disaffection among key constituencies like Black voters in Detroit, for example, or other communities. Now, I spoke also with Abdullah Hammoud, who's the mayor of Dearborn, and he said the reduced turnout there in that city, which is just slightly down from what we saw in August 2022, is a sign that people are still waiting to see what Harris is going to say on issues that are really central to them, namely the conflict between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip.
And I can speak to the state house piece of that question specifically, regardless of what happened in the primary last night. the general election for who controls the state house is going to be very, very competitive in November. A lot of it does depend on what happens at the top of the ticket. It's a battleground state, but there's a lot of really interesting districts at play. Even in 2022, when Democrats secured majority, it was always going to be a nail biter who controls the House. And that makes a huge difference moving forward for Governor Whitmer, for Senate Democrats. If Democrats are able to retain their majority, they're able to get a lot more done without having Republicans in the way. And on the other hand, Republicans want that stopgap to try and stop some of these Democratic policies they've been opposing the last 2 years. So it's a really crucial election, and we're going to see a lot of money being poured into these districts. The primaries were sort of just the opening salvo. We didn't really see most of the big elections, these really competitive races. We just didn't see that in the primary. They're sort of already preparing for the general cycle.
Lauren, what can you tell us about the race for U.S. Senate in Michigan?
Also going to be very, very competitive in the U.S. Senate race. We have seen Alyssa Slotkin as a powerhouse fundraiser. She's already spent a lot of time running statewide ads. Mike Rogers is a pretty big contender here. He also had a commanding victory in the primary yesterday, and it generally is seen as a solid candidate to go against Alyssa Slotkin. For Republicans, this is an uphill battle, however. Democrats have cornered the market on the U.S. Senate seats in Michigan for decades. And nationally speaking, Republicans are looking to make a play at the Senate majority, but they don't need very many seats to do that. So it kind of depends in Michigan if they see Rogers as one of the key races to invest in to try and flip that seat to go towards the overall vote totals, or if they go somewhere where it could be a closer race like Montana or Ohio. So a lot really depends now on, whether Rogers can solidify national support, really continue making a big play for this to be a seat that's considered important nationally, but it will be close.
Yeah, just to speak to Lauren's point earlier too, from a campaign finance perspective, just to add some numbers there, when you look at the last Senate race that Michigan had in 2020 between Gary Peters and John James, they each individually raised about $50 million, which is an enormous sum, a lot of it from national sources. But more than half of all the spending in that race, more than $200 million, came from outside entities, dark money entities and super PACs advertising in the state. And again, as Lauren was saying, they have to be able to signal this is a close, winnable race and is really competitive. Otherwise, we're not going to see that national money flow in. And then it's going to be a lot harder for Mike Rogers and Melissa Slotkin both to get elected because they're not going to have the same level of resources.
I think that's a good point too. Like, we, of course, are primarily covering Michigan and what's going on in Michigan, but there's all these other states at play. And when donors are trying to figure out where they want to send their money to, are they sending it to other states as well? We had a reader who asked a question somewhat similar to what Simon was already talking about. They asked, with Kamala Harris, what will she need to do to win over Arab Americans and other voters who cast uncommitted ballots back in February for the presidential primary? Does her choice of picking Tim Walz over Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro speak to that?
Yeah, I can speak to this briefly. I was speaking with Dearborn Mayor Abdullah Hammoud again this morning, and he had talked to me in hopeful terms about Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. They said this is sort of cracks open the door to support from within the Arab American community on this issue, but he doesn't think that they're there yet. He wants to be able to see not just some of the symbolic sort of subtle gestures that have been made, such as snubbing the attendance of a speech that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gave to Congress in the recent past. He wants to see, and he thinks that his community is going to want to see, an actual call for a permanent ceasefire in the conflict and end to hostilities in order to end civilian casualties in the Palestinian occupied territories in the Gaza Strip. And if that doesn't happen, he doesn't think that necessarily they're going to be won over because either just sort of a lack of addressing the issue or walking a fine line between the two isn't necessarily going to be enough Josh Shapiro, I think, was someone who they were strongly against because of how pro-Israel his stances were. And so it's going to be interesting to see how they walk this fine line without angering the very, very strong pro-Israel lobby in American politics to make this happen.
Well, and if I could jump onto that really quickly too, I covered the uncommitted movement earlier this year during the presidential primary back in February. And if you'll recall, it was something like 13% of voters actually ended up casting an uncommitted ballot, or just over about 100,000 votes. By and large, that is not a very big number. It sounds like a big number. And it is concerning, obviously, for Democrats to have to walk that tightrope between Israel being a national partner, I should say, on the global stage with the US, but also obviously making sure to not anger the Palestinian Arab American voters with their rhetoric on the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. Like I said, though, again, 100,000 individuals turned out to vote uncommitted, which is not an extremely large number of Michigan voters. So it does honestly remain to be seen whether they will focus as much attention on it, frankly, because it is such a lightning rod issue, and anything that is said, either side will find a reason to take offense to it, whether it is a genuine reason or it is sort of like a worked up outrage. So, you know, the Walz pick is definitely the safer pick between Shapiro and he for Kamala Harris, by virtue of it sort of removes any kind of tie to the conflict whatsoever, therefore making him a safer choice.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
but again, I think it's worth noting to our earlier question about media availability. If press has an opportunity to interview Walz and Harris, they're going to ask this question. They're going to want to know what their stance is and nail them down to understand, because right now there's existing in a land of ambiguity to their benefit, because they don't have to necessarily be virulently pro-Israel or virulently pro-ceasefire ending the conflict, or going something that could be interpreted as anti-Israel. And so by not having to answer the questions, that it's great for them because they don't have to. But part of the accountability that reporters are able to provide in campaign cycles like this is that we can really hold candidates to task and say, what is your stance? Spell this out. Tell us directly and bluntly what you intend to do in this, geopolitical crisis.
And then to follow up on that too, if they change their mind or they change their policies or anything like that, I think that's another role that the press plays. We are excited. We've got a couple more reader questions for you all today. Someone asked, at what level of vote difference is a recount mandated?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Of course, a recount can be requested by a candidate, and the rules have recently changed in the legislature. I'm not able to summarize that bill from the top of my head now, but our previous coverage can help provide you with some details on that. But in a statewide race, absent the governing boards of Michigan's public universities, in a statewide race, if the difference between the winning candidate and the losing candidate is less than 2,000 votes, once the election has been certified, an automatic recount is triggered. And so that's generally the bar that we see, at least at the statewide level.
Thank you. We also had a reader who wanted to know about Tim Sneller. He won his district in the Democratic ticket, but he's dead. What happens now?
Yes.
Yeah, so it is unfortunate. Former House Rep Tim Sneller did pass away earlier this year, somewhat unexpectedly. He was on the ticket, as you mentioned, but ballots have already been made. So he will, as far as I understand, granted, I've not worked through a cycle where we're covering somebody who has died while running for office. But from my understanding, there is now a Democratic challenger who is attempting to mount a write-in campaign against the incumbent in that district, who is David Martin. It is a firmly, or I shouldn't say firmly, but it is a pretty Republican district. So whether that effort will be successful, it seems somewhat unlikely, but it is politics, so never say never. But that kind of seems to be where things stand at the moment, is that Democrats will be forced to run a write-in rather than Sneller, who obviously, like we mentioned, has passed away, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. The challenger who has come forward is Matt Shinkler. He is, a longtime former employee of General Motors and has been, a community fixture in Democratic politics for quite some time. He announced his campaign with, quote, deep respect and a heavy heart. Obviously, he was supporting Sneller's candidacy, but stepped in. And part of the dynamics, as Jordan alluded to, Representative Sneller served for 3 terms in the legislature. He was popular in the area, and he was looked at as a really competitive challenger to Representative Martin. Whether Matt Shinkler is as well known or can launch as heated of a challenge remains to be seen.
If I could briefly amend my prior answer on automatic recount, I was able to, our prior reporting, which I was able to consult, while the current threshold is 2,000 votes, from now on, once this legislation is enacted early next year, it'll be 0.1% under a vote total of an election. So last in the 2022 gubernatorial election, that would be 4,391 votes. So it provides a little bit more buffer, but not a huge amount. The elections still have to be extraordinarily close to automatically trigger these recounts.
Thank you for that. So we're just about out of time, but I want to end on what you all are looking forward to in the next approximately 3 months before the election. What's one thing you're keeping an eye out on the campaign trail? Lauren, let's start with you.
What am I keeping an eye on the campaign trail? I've spoken a lot of the things that I will be following. Just some of these really competitive regions where the state house could be in play. Macomb, Oakland, some communities in northern Michigan, both in northwest Michigan and the Upper Peninsula. Jackson is another area that I think will be really interesting in this race to state house. And also, as we mentioned, regarding the U.S. Senate race, we'll definitely be watching, what money is coming in from where our national interests getting really excited about Michigan in the same way that they're getting excited about some of these other competitive seats. Michigan is certainly in one of the top 10 most competitive, but like I said, the numbers come down to a couple of seats when it involves flipping the majority. So it will be really interesting to see to see that get started. I think we've all just been kind of seeing sort of waiting and seeing what happened in the primary, and now it's officially Slotkin versus Rogers. So they get to go at it and run what's expected to be a very competitive campaigns.
Simon?
Yeah, well, I think I got a little bit of a preamble to that yesterday, which is I got to go out to a few polling places and talk to voters. And I always really enjoy being able to speak with people and hear about what's important to them and how they're feeling about elections. Because Michigan, we're blessed with having a lot of diversity of opinion and a lot of diversity of demographics. And so I really enjoy being able to get out to different communities, especially the constituencies that are going to be key to this presidential election, and talk to some of those voters and see, what is the fulcrum in which their vote is going to swing, especially if they're a persuadable individual. Increasingly, those voters are more difficult to find. But I think one question that I want to have answered or be able to provide readers with in more detail is we have an administration right now in Washington who has a trunk load of positive macroeconomic data that they can tout over the past 4 years about how just gangbusters our economy is doing. And clearly, when you talk to people at the micro level, at the individual level, I was speaking to a mechanic for a cement company in Otto, Michigan yesterday, and he was telling me about he can't hardly put food on the table, even though he's been working this job for years and years. And being able to look at that disconnect and understand that economic impact at the individual level and how Democrats are going to try to reach those folks about economic opportunity is something I'm really interested in.
Jordan?
Yeah, just kind of bouncing off of that. Personally, with respect to races, I know one that I feel hasn't even started yet, but now officially will, that the primary is over, is the race between Curtis Hertel and Tom Barrett. They are running to replace Alyssa Slotkin in her U.S. House seat. Neither of them faced any primary challengers in the primary last night, so we haven't really seen them at their best, so to speak, going off against each other. They did have a debate early on in the primary, a small private event, which was, fine, well attended. Nothing crazy came out of it though, but now they're going to have to really start campaigning. They're going to have to really start hitting the ground. And it's a district that really could go either way, frankly. Barrett had run against Slotkin in 2022 and lost to her, I believe, by about 6 percentage points. But Slotkin also is a historic great fundraiser and had a lot of name recognition being the incumbent in that district. Now, both of those individuals have served in the Michigan legislature, so there's a little bit of name ID there, but just trying to see what's going to happen there, I think will be a really interesting sort of weather vane for the, I believe, the 7th Congressional District. Now, with respect to sort of policies or greater movements, as we talked about earlier, I am extremely interested in following whether or not the vote uncommitted effort or the pushback against the ongoing war in Gaza, how much of an effect that will have in Michigan. We do have a large number of Muslim and Arab American voters in this state. So obviously, I know I said earlier that there was about a 100,000 person movement to vote uncommitted earlier in this year. But I will be curious to see how many of those people do end up either A, staying home, or B, casting a ballot for another individual, be that RFK, be that, you know, just a random write-in candidate as a sort of protest vote. So I'm very interested to see what's going to happen there. And I'm interested to see how much this Democratic momentum is going to keep going. You know, we talked earlier about voter apathy. We talked earlier about Democrats feeling very defeated, but there is a rejuvenated sense of competition now. You've seen people post online that, you know, younger voters, was this what it was like during 2008 with Obama? I mean, that might be a bit of an exaggeration here, obviously, them not having been able to vote in that past election, but there is a renewed sense of an idea that Democrats can actually be competitive against Trump. And I'm curious to see how far that momentum carries and what exactly that does mean moving forward.
Thanks for that, Jordan and Simon and Lauren. You know, in this conversation, we've talked about vibes, we've talked about voters, we've talked about constituencies, we've talked about Congress, we've talked about politics, policies, and press access. And we love Michigan and we want to be there for you. You can see it in the fact that Lauren is literally wearing a Detroit shirt right now. If you have more questions for our team, you can drop them in the chat. You can reach out to us directly. You can also subscribe to our free Politics Watch newsletter. You can do that at bridgemi.com/sign-up. We are really excited that you spent some of your morning with us, especially after a busy election cycle. We are so excited to continue this reporting for you. We've got a nonpartisan voter guide on our website. We have a regularly updated elections tracker, and we have a full team of reporters ready to visit rallies, to ask voters questions, and to answer your questions. If you want to see even more political news, you can go to our website, bridgemi.com. We'll have a full recap of today's event later on today. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back next week.